When you hear the word Antarctica, you probably picture a white, silent desert with a few clumsy penguins waddling across the ice. But what if I told you that, long before it became this frozen graveyard, this place was once a green, warm world filled with monsters? A setting so strange it would make most modern documentaries look tame. My name is Arthenox, and this is my channel, Cloaked Mysteries. Today, you're going to travel with me through layers of ice and time to visit this lost world of Antarctica, a place where tropical forests covered the ground, dinosaurs crossed land bridges that no longer exist on today's maps, and sea creatures hunted like silent demons. Turn up the volume, turn off the lights, and get ready to look at the most isolated continent on Earth with new eyes. Nothing you think you know about Antarctica will stay the same after this. There was a time when, if you were dropped in the middle of Antarctica, you probably wouldn't even realize where you were. Instead of endless ice, the landscape was dominated by dense forests, powerful rivers, and a sky sliced by flocks of birds and strange creatures. The continent wasn't isolated at the far southern end of the planet. It was much farther north, pressed up against neighbors that today seem distant. South America, Australia, and Antarctica once formed a kind of giant archipelago of connected lands. These connections were made by land bridges, exposed regions of crust that linked one continent to another like natural corridors. Through them, plants, mammals, and dinosaurs crossed freely, never imagining that one day that entire world would vanish beneath kilometers of ice. Antarctica, far from being a prison of frozen rock, functioned as a living avenue of migration, a strategic crossroads on the board of prehistoric life. Thanks to these connections, paleontologists have found sauropod skulls that are almost identical in South America, Antarctica, and Australia. That tells us that large herbivorous dinosaurs were crossing the continent as if it were just another leg of their journey. For many of them, Antarctica wasn't just a passageway, it was home. They settled there, taking advantage of a climate that was nothing like the frozen hell we see today. During the Mesozoic, especially in the Cretaceous period, global temperatures were higher, and Antarctica sat in far less extreme positions on the map. Average air temperatures could reach around 12 C, comparable to some modern European countries like Germany. Far from being a white desert, it was a comfortable region with rainy seasons, flowing rivers, and fertile soils. A perfect setting for lush forests and large herds of herbivores. Instead of the absolute white that dominates today, what really ruled the landscape was deep green. Conifers, giant ferns, flowering plants, and strange shrubs formed the backbone of this vegetation. Trails trampled by dinosaurs cut through clearings, while enormous leaves carpeted the ground like living rugs. If you were dropped there without a map, you'd hardly guess you were in Antarctica. This warm, vibrant environment, fully connected to the rest of the world, was the stage where the continent began its long transformation. The same Antarctica that seems dead today pulsed with life back then. But like every world that burns too bright, it was destined to face disasters on the same scale. And the first of them came from the sky, with enough force to change not just a continent, but the entire history of life on Earth. The end of the dinosaur age was not a local event. When the famous asteroid slammed into Earth, it didn't just destroy everything around the crater. It reshaped the global climate, affecting every corner of the planet, including Antarctica. Even far from the impact site, the continent felt the shock like a slow-moving, lethal wave. The first consequences were brutal. The energy released was so immense that it likely generated colossal tsunamis, powerful enough to scour Antarctica's coastlines as if they were made of paper. Entire forests may have been uprooted, animals swept away, and valleys filled with water and debris. The air, heated to absurd temperatures, would have burned any exposed creature, like an invisible furnace. After the fire came the darkness. Dust, sulfur, and particles thrown into the atmosphere by the collision rose high and blocked much of the sunlight. Regions that once basked in long days of light now faced a dim, opaque sky and a rising cold. Without enough sunlight, plants began to die, and with them, the base of the entire food chain collapsed. Antarctica, which had already been slowly drifting toward isolation in the south, saw that process accelerate its fate. With less solar energy reaching the planet, global temperatures began to fall. and places that were already inclined to be colder like the high latitudes near the poles froze faster. The continent began to experience ice not just as a season, but as a new permanent condition. Many dinosaurs that once walked through those forests simply vanished from the record, swallowed by a deadly mix of hunger, cold, and environmental collapse. What had once been a land of giants turned into a quiet, desolate territory, with only a few survivors struggling to adapt to a new world. The ice advanced, the forests retreated, and Antarctica took its first step toward earning the title of frozen continent. But the story didn't end there. What almost nobody imagines is that, after this period of disaster, the climatic pendulum swung to the opposite side. Instead of remaining trapped in eternal winter, the planet entered a period of extreme heat. And Antarctica, which had already been green once, warmed up again in a way that bordered on the absurd hotter than many tropical places we know today. After the chaos of mass extinction, the planet began to rearrange itself. Temperatures, once crushed by atmospheric dust, started to rise again. Only this time, they went far beyond what we'd call comfortable. Earth entered what could be described as a super greenhouse phase, a time when the heat seemed determined to make up for everything the cold had taken. The exact source of this warming is still debated, but one thing is clear: enormous amounts of carbon dioxide were released into the atmosphere. This extra CO worked like a thick blanket wrapped around the planet, trapping heat and turning Earth into a global greenhouse. It's within this context that Antarctica became something no modern map would ever suggest. During the so-called Eocene thermal maximum, average temperatures in Antarctica may have reached around 25 C, similar to today's climate in regions like Kenya. Instead of biting winds and frozen surfaces, imagine warm, humid air, with rivers flowing between forests and swamps. The continent had already moved farther south, but it still didn't occupy the extreme position it does today. In these conditions, plants that today would never survive in Antarctica thrived. Palm trees, swamp cypresses, broadleaf trees, and aquatic vegetation took over lakes and riverbanks. Anyone walking through that landscape would probably feel like they were on some strange tropical island, filled with a mix of fauna and flora that doesn't look quite like any place on Earth today. But behind this almost paradise-like appearance, there was a disturbing detail: the environment was still hostile, just in a different way. Excessive heat, ecosystems changing at high speed, and a constantly competing fauna made life there anything but peaceful. The animals that called Antarctica home had to deal with fast predators, aquatic ambushes, and climate shifts that never really stopped. While today the largest permanent land predator in Antarctica is a tiny wingless insect, back then that would have been almost a joke. The title of top monster in the food chain belonged to something far more terrifying: a creature that walked on solid ground and looked, in a deeply unsettling way, like the dinosaurs the planet had supposedly just lost. In warm Paleogene Antarctica, the top of the food chain didn't belong to mammals, but to monstrous birds. They didn't fly, they didn't sing, and they definitely didn't look anything like the friendly birds we're used to. These were the so-called terror birds, distant relatives of modern birds, but much closer in spirit to the predatory dinosaurs of the past. These birds, known as Phorusrhacidae, were giants with powerful, hooked beaks built to tear flesh with ease. Their large, sharp heads worked like living battle axes. With a single quick strike, they could break bones or rip muscle apart. Unlike many modern predators that rely on teeth, they used their entire skull as a weapon. Their legs were long and muscular, equipped with sickle-shaped claws. They looked disturbingly similar to the feet of ancient dromaeosaurs, like the famous raptors. That was no coincidence. Functionally, these birds filled the same niche as those two-legged dinosaur hunters: fast, agile, and lethal. When they ran, they could easily exceed 50 km/h, turning any attempt at escape into a desperate gamble. The Antarctic species, still not formally described, is considered one of the most lethal in the entire group. It would have looked a lot like large members such as Phorusrhacos, which reached about 2.5 meters in height and more than 130 kilograms in weight. Think of it as 3 wolves stacked on top of each other in the shape of a bird, with zero interest in howling. They patrolled forests and open fields, absolute rulers of the land. These terror birds didn't show up in Antarctica by chance. They used the same land bridge that once linked the continent to South America, migrating gradually until they took control of this new frontier. When they crossed that invisible line between the two worlds, they brought with them a brutal imbalance. Local herbivores and small mammals suddenly had a brand new nightmare to fear. But the terror birds weren't hunting in an empty world. Their success depended on something essential: plenty of prey. And Antarctica, at that time, offered exactly that, thanks to a cast of bizarre, ancient, and improbable mammals, creatures that mashed together familiar traits and almost alien details, like evolutionary experiments that never made it to the present. To really understand this lost world, you have to look beyond the predators. The backbone of Paleogene Antarctic life on land was made up of mammals that, at first glance, would look like exaggerated versions of animals we know. Many of them were typical of South America, brought over by the same continental connection that allowed the terror birds to arrive. Among these giant herbivores were the Astropatheria, an extinct group with an appearance vaguely reminiscent of clumsy rhinoceroses. In Antarctica, two genera stand out: Trigonostelops and Antarctodon. They had strange, enlarged, and specialized teeth, perfect for processing tough vegetation. Despite their intimidating faces, they were peaceful with the environment, if not with the plants. Some studies suggest that certain species of Antarctodon may have approached half a ton, though those estimates are still debated. Walking alongside them was Nociolophos, probably the largest confirmed land animal in Antarctica after the age of dinosaurs, weighing around 400 kilograms. In size, it could be compared to a modern muskox, roaming through clearings and more open areas. These large herbivores were part of the Litopterns, an extinct order of South American ungulates that included some very peculiar forms. One example is Victor Lemoynia, a smaller litoptern with an intriguing anatomical detail: nostrils positioned high on the snout. That suggests it may have had a small trunk, prehensile lips, or even a structure similar to the nose of a saiga antelope. Beyond the big mammals, Antarctica also hosted smaller but equally important creatures. There was an undescribed Xenarthran, a distant relative of sloths and armadillos, as well as groups like the Gondwanatherians and Meridiolestids. These last ones are informally nicknamed saber-toothed squirrels because of their elongated teeth. Small and flexible in their diet, they were probably among the survivors of the event that wiped out the dinosaurs. This mosaic becomes even more interesting when you add marsupials to the scene. Today, when we think of them, we go straight to Australia in our minds. But the origin of that story is different. Many marsupials evolved first in South America, then migrated to Antarctica, and finally reached Australia through yet another land bridge. Once again, Antarctica was both a passage and a stage. If the continent already sounded hostile on land, things got even worse near the water. Rivers, lakes, and coastal environments in Paleogene Antarctica were the domain of giant crocodilians, creatures you would never associate with today's ice. For a long time, the idea of crocodiles in Antarctica was just speculation, until the right fossil surfaced. The decisive discovery was a huge osteoderm, a bony armor plate typical of crocodiles. Dated to the Eocene, it showed the same pattern seen in living and known fossil species. From that single piece, scientists estimated that the animal it belonged to could have reached about 7 meters in length, bigger than many modern saltwater crocodiles. At that size, these crocodilians easily ranked among the largest predators on the continent, right alongside the terror birds. Their strategy, however, was different. Instead of sprinting across open ground, they preferred ambush. They hid in murky waters, close to riverbanks and lake shores, waiting for some distracted mammal to come too close for a drink. When they attacked, the combination of crushing jaws and overwhelming body mass turned every encounter into an all-or-nothing game. For a Nociolophos, stepping too close to the edge could mean disappearing in seconds, dragged underwater by a sudden strike. These crocodiles were opportunistic hunters, capable of taking down whatever came within reach. There are signs they weren't alone. Fossils found in nearby regions suggest the presence of more specialized crocodilians, possibly with diets focused on fish. That points to a complex aquatic ecosystem, where different species competed for niches and prey. In any case, the message was clear in green Antarctica: water was never truly safe. And as if giant crocodiles weren't enough of a problem, danger also came from above and from the open ocean. Antarctica's coasts were the stage for constant battles between primitive whales, colossal sharks, and diving birds. Among the victims and survivors of this chaos, one old acquaintance of ours held a special place: the penguins. But back then, they were nothing like the small figures we see today. Today, when we think of penguins, we picture adorable animals perfectly adapted to extreme cold. But their origin is much hotter than it seems. Penguins first evolved along warm coasts in the region of Australia and New Zealand millions of years before they spread into Antarctica. And when they finally reached the continent, they found a true paradise and a kind of hell at the same time. During the Paleogene, at least 16 species of penguins lived in Antarctica, many of them giants. The modern emperor penguin, with its 45 kilograms and roughly 4 to 5 feet in height, would look small next to monsters like Anthropornis and Polyps. These titans could surpass 2 meters in height and weigh well over 100 kilograms, literally taller than Michael Jordan. These giant penguins were exceptional divers. They could hold their breath for long periods, hunting fish, squid, and other marine animals in depths where sunlight barely reached. Their thick layer of fat helped conserve energy in cold waters, but it was no guarantee of safety. In the warm oceans of ancient Antarctica, everything was hunting something. In those same waters swam primitive whales, like an as yet undescribed basilosaurid with a long, serpentine body, massive jaws, and teeth made to pierce bone. This animal could reach around 12 meters in length and probably fed on almost anything that fit into its mouth: large fish, giant sea turtles, and possibly distracted giant penguins. Alongside these toothed whales were colossi like Lanocetus, an early baleen whale that still retained functional teeth. Even as a youngster, a single individual could reach sizes comparable to the largest modern orcas. Using a mix of suction and biting, these whales could catch a wide variety of prey, including fish, cephalopods, and even smaller sharks. They were the Antarctic counterparts of the ancient mosasaurs, dominating both shallow and deeper waters. And if the seas were already dangerous with whales like these, we still haven't talked about the sharks. Antarctica in this period could be compared to a Paleogene Australia, given how many shark species prowled its coasts. There were extinct basking sharks, early mako-like sharks, and, towering above many of them, 2 members of the genus Otodus, distant, ancient relatives of the famous megalodon. These predators could reach around 9.5 meters in length, sharing the same hunting grounds as giant whales. While seas and rivers were ruled by crocodiles, whales, and sharks, the Paleogene Antarctic sky had its own monsters. The region may have been an important cradle for the evolution of modern birds, with fossils like Vagavis suggesting that some lineages that survived the asteroid impact may have arisen there. In that sense, Antarctica wasn't just a backdrop, it was an evolutionary laboratory. Over time, bird diversity exploded. Primitive falcons, ancestral albatrosses, petrels, and other marine species filled the air and the coasts, hunting fish and small animals. But none of them drew as much attention as a giant with absurd wings and a look straight out of a nightmare: Dinosaurs, a member of the Pelagornithidae family. Pelagornithids were famous for one macabre feature: their teeth. They weren't real teeth, but bony projections along the beak, forming frightening serrated rows. In Dinosaurs, that jagged beak gave the animal an almost demonic expression, like a cross between an albatross and a sea monster. Any fish that ventured too close to the surface risked being snatched in an instant. On top of that, the size was staggering. Dinosaurs could have a wingspan between 5 and 6 meters, about the width of a small airplane, or the size of a large pterosaur like Pteranodon. Despite that, it was a fragile giant. Its bones were extremely light and delicate, built for long-distance soaring, not for combat. It hunted by gliding over the sea, striking quickly and precisely. In this world, giant penguins, terror birds, 7-meter crocodiles, predatory whales, and colossal sharks all coexisted in an unstable balance. Every niche was contested. Every riverbank could be a trap. Every dive came with a very real chance of not coming back. Antarctica was a chaotic, living stage, where death was just part of the daily routine and time seemed to move on a different scale. But none of these creatures had any idea what was approaching. The true threat had no teeth, no claws, no wings. It arrived in the form of temperature and isolation, silent and slow. What happened next would turn this green and chaotic world into the white, almost barren land we know today, a final sentence for most of the inhabitants of this hidden planet. At some point around 34 million years ago, the planet started changing again, this time in an irreversible direction. Antarctica finally broke away from its old neighbors, opening the Drake Passage between it and South America, and the Tasmanian Passage between it and Australia. With that, the Antarctic circumpolar current was born, a ring of cold water that sealed the continent off like a fortress. This current prevented warm waters from reaching Antarctica's coasts and also helped pull CO out of the atmosphere. The result was a brutal, accelerated cooling. The first great ice sheets began to form, marking the start of the long glacial era in which, technically, we still live today. The green continent started disappearing beneath a white crust that grew thicker year after year. The changes came too fast. Forests were destroyed. Habitats shrank. Food chains collapsed. Mammals, giant birds, crocodiles, and whales that depended on that delicate balance suddenly found themselves trapped in a world that was vanishing under their feet. Some groups managed to escape to other parts of the planet. Most, however, were simply erased from history. Over millions of years, the ice kept advancing, becoming thicker and reflecting more and more sunlight back into space. Antarctica turned into a cold mirror, reinforcing its own freezing. For a while, a few regions remained ice-free, serving as a last refuge for a fading fauna. But in the end, even those safe havens were swallowed. Today, when we look at Antarctica, we only see the surface of the story. Beneath kilometers of ice, there may be fossils, fossilized forests, and perhaps clues to ecosystems we've barely begun to imagine. To explore all of that would have to disturb one of the most fragile environments on the planet. So the question remains, what is worth more, the knowledge or the stability of this place? If you've made it this far, tell me in the comments which creature from this lost world of Antarctica captured your imagination the most? The terror birds? The giant crocodiles? The penguins taller than a basketball player? And if you love traveling through these forgotten corners of Earth's history, subscribe to Cloaked Mysteries, hit the notification bell, and come with me to explore other worlds that time tried to hide. Because behind every layer of ice, there's always another layer of mystery.